The Razee Saga. Part 21. The Black Chorus. The council chamber moved with its usual rhythm, reports droning of shipyards meeting quotas, halo nets calibrated and strengthened, Unity fleets taking shape at the Shield planet. For a moment, it seemed like the Alliance had found a fragile balance in the war. Then Stephen began to laugh. It burst out of him like a crack in glass, startling in its sharpness, wholly out of place in the chamber of war. His laugh twisted into a ragged choke as his knees buckled. Steve Bott lunged forward, eyes flashing red as its heavy frame caught him before he struck the floor. The mark on Stephen's arm glowed with searing light, its radiance bleeding through the fabric as if the skin itself had turned to flame. The holomap shifted at the same time. What had been scattered pinpricks of threat now spiraled outward in a pattern no one had ever seen. Seams blossomed in multiple quadrants simultaneously, not random, not probing, but coordinated in cadence like a great choir finding its note. Lines of red arced across the stars, converging into a spiral that tightened around a point of darkness that had never been charted. The chamber froze in silence as the implications sank in. No longer scattered strikes. No longer scattered voices. The choir had unified its song. Stephen steadied himself against Steve Bott, trembling but insistent, his arms still blazing with resonance. He lifted a shaking hand toward the holomap, dragging lines across the projection until they met at the dark convergence. His voice was weak, but it carried. That was the heart of it. That was where the song was being drawn from. Around him, alarms triggered in rapid succession. Operators confirmed seams opening at the outer edges of Dominion space, others building pressure around old corridors between Alliance strongholds, still more flickering like storms across uncharted void. The pattern was deliberate, precise, a war front forming across the stars. Fleet Admiral Rivers did not speak at first. His gaze lingered on the spiral forming in the holomap, his hands resting on the rail as though steadying himself for the inevitable. The council felt the weight of the moment without needing words. The listeners were no longer testing. The Black Chorus had begun. Orders moved out of Sentinel within moments. The shadows stirred from their cloaked stations, folding space like blades unsheathed. Unity fleets lit their lock points and began their transit into readiness. The Razee 2 powered up, engines humming with a resonance that rolled through its hull like the breath of a storm. The quiet order of the council chamber dissolved into urgency. Maps filled with red arcs, blue counterarcs, the symbols of fleets converging on pre-marked coordinates. Shadows fanned outward to intercept, Unity vessels preparing to form into paradox shape, warhammers and destroyers aligning into defensive latticework. The first wave of the choir was already unfolding, and this time, it was not the voice of scattered whispers but the rising hymn of war. The alarms carried across Sentinel like rolling thunder, pulsing in rhythm with the holomap's red bloom. The first strike of the Black Chorus came not at the Alliance heart but at the edges, a Dominion world that had argued against Unity only cycles before. Seams split open in its orbit, dozens at once, forming a jagged crown around the planet. Unity Fleet 17 and 2 Shadows were already inbound, their orders carried from Sentinel before the alarms had even sounded. They emerged into a system under siege, the air around them thick with silence that pressed against every hull like a suffocating tide. The halo net held for minutes, its latticework glowing bright as it absorbed the first resonance assault. But the listeners had changed. Their ships came not in ragged lines but in formation, their harmonics synchronized into waves that struck with unnatural precision. Each blast was timed to the next, pounding in rhythm, fracturing the halo lattice like glass under a hammer. The Unity captains responded by locking vessels into paradox shape. 12 ships merged shields and power, their pulse cannon throats charging. A single shot lanced outward, collapsing half the seams in a single strike, buying the planet precious minutes of breath. The shadows fanned wide, raising their domes over both planet and fleet. Their shields absorbed the silencing beams that would have gutted destroyers and frigates outright. Their resonance cores strained, hulls trembling as the Black Chorus adjusted pitch. Silence deepened, pressing harder. One shadow staggered as its shields flickered. Its crew rerouted every reserve into the resonance dome, refusing to let the barrier collapse. It unleashed a surge of stored energy, its pulse detonating across the battlefield like lightning. The silence broke for a moment. Dozens of seams shriveled and snapped shut, their forms imploding in on themselves. The planet below still shook. Surface cities dimmed as the strain of the halo net drained their power grids. Emergency bunkers sealed tight, millions huddling in the dark as the battle lit the skies above them. The Unity fleet, battered but unbroken, fired a second synchronized volley. Another cluster of seams folded closed, the resonance ripple carrying across space like a drumbeat. The listeners retreated not because they were defeated but because they had measured. Their ships folded back into silence, their song unfinished. The system survived, but the price was heavy. One shadow floated crippled, its hull blackened and its shields burnt away. The Unity vessels remained locked together, unable to separate until repairs could stabilize their systems. From Sentinel, the battle was read in silence. The Black Chorus had not been repelled. It had tested, measured, and left. It would return stronger, and the Council knew it. The holomap dimmed, but the red traces remained like scars across the stars. The first wave was not the end. It was the opening note. The reports returned to Sentinel in fragments of light and sound, stitched together by the shadows that had stood at the heart of the battle. Their sensors had recorded every harmonic, every pitch and wave of the Black Chorus as it struck. The data spread across the chamber like strands of dark music given form. The Dominion delegates whispered of retreat, voices brittle from fear. They argued that if the choir could bend resonance itself into a weapon, then no wall could truly hold. Others struck back with anger, demanding stronger halo nets, more shadows, more Unity fleets. The Council became a storm of voices, loud but uncertain, each carrying the same root of fear. Rivers sat with the data glowing before him. The recordings were not chaos. They were measured, layered, deliberate. The choir was building its attack in patterned waves, its harmonics designed to break shields by finding their weakness and pressing in rhythm. What had seemed unstoppable in the moment was now revealed as a song that could be studied. He ordered every engineer and scientist across Alliance and Dominion to study the resonance makeup. Shields would be layered against the wave itself, not just raw strength but tuned resistance, an answer that bent with the song instead of breaking under it. Every ship that bore a shield generator would be upgraded. Every shadow would carry new harmonics designed to resonate with the choir rather than collapse beneath it. Stephen sat pale and silent, his mark dimmed after its earlier fire. He had felt the cadence before it struck, the building rhythm of silence pressed against the world. Now he saw the recordings and nodded slowly. This was not an invincible wall. It was a choir that could be met with its own harmony. The chamber calmed only slightly. Some still whispered that no fleet could endure another wave if it struck with greater force. Some argued that unity itself was the only defense, and that fear was the greater enemy than silence. The debates swirled, but Rivers had already set the course. The shadows had given them more than a battle. They had given them a song to study, a weapon to answer, a map of how the abyss itself thought. Outside the chamber, shipyards powered into overdrive. Shield arrays were torn apart and rebuilt, generators tuned and calibrated with new resonance models. Engineers spoke of shields that could bend and flex like a second skin, absorbing silence and reflecting it back. For the first time since the battle began, the Council had more than fear. They had work. Stephen sat in the dim stillness of his private chamber, the glow of his mark pulsing faintly against the skin of his forearm. Steve Bott stood nearby, humming with quiet vigilance, its eyes shifting between amber and deep blue as if some current of thought was passing through it that it could not fully hold back. The silence was not empty. Stephen felt Sentinel beneath his feet, the constant weight of a living world pressing into his mind, its voice a deep and steady bassline in his thoughts. But tonight another presence threaded through that resonance. Brother. Its tone was different, higher and sharper, like mountain stone cracking in fire. The two kin were speaking and he was caught between them. Sentinel's presence was cautious, rooted, ancient in its patience. Brother's voice carried urgency and fire, its thoughts rushing forward like a river that refused to be dammed. The message was not for Stephen alone. Brother was pressing Sentinel, demanding that it share what it had always kept locked away. Blueprints, designs, the knowledge to build more kinships. Stephen gripped the arms of his chair as the feelings poured through him. He saw flashes of great constructs orbiting dead stars, kinships shattered and left adrift in silence. He felt Brother's fury at being the last. its desperate drive to ensure that Sentinel would not fall as the others had. It demanded that the Alliance be given the means to build more of their kind, to stand as kin reborn in steel and resonance. The mark on his arm flared. Steve Bot's chest split open with a surge of energy. A projection burst into the room, light folding into the vast image of Brother itself. Not a planet, not a fortress, but a living ship whose silhouette was both mountain and cathedral, its resonance cores burning like stars beneath its skin. Stephen gasped as the hologram shifted, fragmenting into schematics. The internal lattice of power conduits, the resonance wells, the shielding architecture layered in spirals of ancient design. Knowledge so immense it weighed on the air itself, as if gravity had shifted inside the chamber. Steve Bot trembled, its body glowing from within, the data almost too vast for it to hold. The vision pressed against Stephen's mind until it nearly broke him. He understood only fragments, but the message was clear. Brother had given them the path to create more. The Alliance no longer needed to rely on finding remnants in the void. The kin could be reborn by human and Dominion hands. The projection faded. Steve Bot collapsed into stillness, its frame cooling as smoke hissed from its joints. Stephen sagged forward, his breath coming ragged, his body spent but his spirit alight with fire. Sentinel's presence lingered, heavy with worry, but it did not deny Brother's demand. The path was open now, and the knowledge had been given. Outside the chamber, the first shield tests began across Sentinel's orbit. Engineers watched as the upgraded arrays hummed with new resonance, bending under simulated silence waves and holding instead of breaking. The data was promising. The new shields would flex with the choir's song instead of shattering beneath it. But Stephen knew the shields were only one answer. The greater gift had been given in secret. More kin ships could rise if the Alliance was willing to bear the cost. Stephen stood before Rivers in the private chamber, his body still weak but his presence sharp. Steve Bot loomed beside him, its chest plate glowing with faint blue lines, the resonance of Sentinel's voice stored within. For hours it had remained silent, the weight of Brother's revelation still pressing on Stephen's thoughts. But now the construct stirred. Panels parted, and a cascade of light unfurled into the chamber. 5 distinct schematics hovered in the air, massive silhouettes traced in glowing arcs. Each was a different shape, a different song in steel, the echoes of kin worlds long gone. One resembled Brother's cathedral-like structure. Another carried a design like coiled wings folded around a resonance core. Another was sharp and angular, made for war without hesitation. Each blueprint radiated the memory of a kin that had once lived, fought, and fallen. Stephen explained that Sentinel had released only 5 designs, holding the rest back. Steve Bot had reached its limit. Its frame quivered even now under the weight of the data it carried. Its capacitors strained and memory banks filled to the edge. Stephen's voice trembled with awe. For a construct with 30 petabytes of storage to be pushed to capacity, the knowledge of the kin must be staggering. And there were more locked still within Sentinel's depths. Rivers studied the designs in silence. The possibilities stretched before him. 5 new kin ships, each unlike anything the Alliance had ever built. It was both hope and burden, an armory of gods placed in their hands. He turned to his console and opened a private channel to Earth, his tone steady but weighted. Build requests were coming. The forges of Earth would need to begin construction as soon as possible. The reply came back swiftly. The last 3 shadows of the initial expansion were nearly complete, 70% through assembly. They would not be released until the new shield upgrades were finished unless a crisis forced their hand. The engineers would not risk fielding them vulnerable. The words carried caution but also a spark of pride. Earth was producing at a pace that even war could barely outstrip. Rivers closed the line and sat in stillness for a moment. The Alliance was no longer defending with desperation alone. They were building towards something larger, something capable of answering the abyss not just with survival but with defiance. In orbit above Sentinel, the first wave of shield testing scaled upward. Fleets rotated into position, each ship activating its upgraded lattice. Artificial silence storms were generated, harmonic blasts simulating the cadence of the Black Chorus as recorded by the shadows. The new shields flexed and bent under the pressure, but they did not break. They held, shimmering in arcs of light that absorbed resonance instead of collapsing before it. Engineers recorded the data with feverish urgency, scientists tuning frequencies in real time, warships shifting from weakness to strength with every cycle. Across the system, the hum of the halo nets deepened, altered to mirror the new resonance principles. They were no longer static walls. They were living barriers, harmonized to sing against silence itself. The Alliance was learning. And for the first time since the war began, silence no longer felt like inevitability. It felt like a challenge they could meet. The silence came first, long before the alarms. A weight pressed across the halo nets of a Dominion frontier world. A silence so deep it made the stars seem to dim. Operators leaned over their stations, whispering reports before the first seams even split. The black chorus returned. Seams opened in concentric rings, each tearing into existence with unnatural precision. Listener ships poured through, their resonance tuned to the same measured cadence as the Dominion strike days before. This was not random. They were testing, repeating, learning what the Alliance had built to answer them. The first Unity fleet and its paired shadows jumped into orbit, locking their formations as the seams multiplied. Their shields shimmered, already glowing under the strain of silence waves. But this time the silence did not shatter them. The new resonance lattices flexed like taut cords, absorbing the waves and bending them aside. What would have cracked a dome and gutted a destroyer now left only rippling arcs of light across the shields. The black chorus shifted its pitch, layering harmonic bursts in quick succession. Seams rippled, the air between them trembling with resonance. The ships locked inside struggled, their crews rattled by the deep hum echoing through their hulls. Yet still the shields held. The shadows fanned wide, projecting their domes over the planet below. A colossal silencing beam struck one square on the bow. Its hull buckled, its lights flickered, but the resonance fields bent instead of breaking. A burst of captured energy rippled outward, scattering the silence like a shattering mirror. The Unity fleet responded in kind. Their cannons charged as one, 12 ships merging into paradox form, their resonance cores aligned. A single pulse erupted, its spiral of energy tearing through half a dozen seams at once. Listener ships tumbled, their harmonic fields disrupted, their silence scattered into fractured notes. But the black chorus adapted again. Larger ships emerged, cathedral-like silhouettes glowing with stolen technology. They sang a deeper resonance, not aimed at shields this time but at fold space itself. Engines stuttered. Smaller craft dropped from formation as their jump systems bled energy. The battlefield bent, threatening to collapse in on itself. Gemini fleet arrived in that moment, Scuda V and its escorts cutting through the chaos like a spear. The Warhammers concentrated fire on the cathedral ships, battering them with coordinated resonance charges. Arclight led the counterstrike, unleashing a resonance storm that unraveled two seams before they could widen. The battle raged for hours. Shields flexed and groaned, some cracking but none collapsing outright. The new upgrades had changed the rhythm. Silence no longer smothered fleets in moments. It forced the listeners to push harder, to spend more of themselves just to breach the line. At last, the remaining seams folded closed. The listener ships retreated into the void, their cadence disrupted, their cathedral vessels limping back through the rift. The fleets remained, battered but standing. Engineers logged every strike, every resonance note, every shift in the enemy's song. They had survived not by luck but by design. The new shields had done their work. Yet even in victory there was no cheer. The listeners had learned as much as the Alliance. And the next chorus would come louder still. The battlefield quieted, its silence no longer imposed by the choir but left behind as a hollow echo. Fleets limped back to their stations, damage reports streaming across Sentinel. Warhammers returned scorched, frigates bled power, shadows staggered under the weight of resonance they had absorbed. Yet the shields had held. For the first time, a full-scale assault had been repelled without collapse. On Sentinel, the council chamber was heavy with the smoke of weary arguments. Engineers presented data from the surviving shadows, resonance charts spooling across the holomap. The enemy's cadence had been mapped note by note, their patterns dissected with surgical precision. Shield upgrades had proven viable. Pulse cannons had fractured seams faster than before. For once, the numbers leaned toward survival rather than annihilation. Still, fear rippled through the chamber. The listeners had adapted mid-battle. Their cathedral vessels had warped fold space, interfering with jumps in a way no defense yet countered. If the choir pressed harder, if they opened 100 seams at once, even the strongest fleet might still break. The council's voices wavered between triumph and dread, a pendulum swinging too fast to settle. Rivers listened without interruption, his hands clasped against the rail. Every success was only another step on a path that demanded more of them. They had survived one chorus. The next would strike louder. Stephen had not joined the council session. He sat instead in his chambers, Steve Bott standing over him like a silent sentinel. His mark pulsed steadily, a rhythm that no longer burned but carried weight all the same. When he closed his eyes, the voices came again. This time there was no war song, no cadence of destruction. It was a dialogue. Sentinel's voice was slow and grounded, ancient patience vibrating through his chest. Brother's voice was sharp and insistent, like fire striking stone. They spoke not in words but in currents of thought that pressed against Stephen's mind until it blurred the edges of his perception. Brother demanded. Sentinel hesitated. Stephen felt the struggle between them, one urging the sharing of knowledge, the other reluctant to expose more than had already been given. The pressure built until Steve Bott shuddered and flared with light. Panels split open, releasing a projection that bathed the chamber in blue fire. A vision unfolded in the air. A kin ship unlike Brother, curved like a crescent blade around a single burning core. Another followed, shaped like interlocking rings, its design humming with layered harmonics. 3 more appeared, each distinct, each a relic of kin worlds that no longer stood. Stephen understood. 5 sets of blueprints had been released, carried within Steve Bott's vast storage, each one different. The designs of lost kin worlds, preserved by Sentinel and now revealed at Brother's insistence. The construct trembled as the projection faded, its systems straining under the weight of what it held. For all its capacity, Steve Bott had reached its limit. There were more blueprints within Sentinel locked away beyond what the machine could bear. Stephen leaned back in exhaustion, the weight of revelation pressing him into the chair. The knowledge had been given, but only a fraction of what lay buried in the kin's memory. The rest would come only when they found a way to carry it. Across Sentinel's orbit, shield upgrades expanded across the fleets. Warships cycled through testing, their lattices glowing brighter with each calibrated pass. The Alliance was changing, building, adapting. Yet Stephen knew their greatest weapon was not the shields, nor even the shadows. It was the promise that the kin might rise again. Stephen entered the Admiral's quarters, still pale from his vision. The weight of the blueprints pulsed in his mind and burned in Steve Bott's core. Rivers was not alone. Isabella sat beside him at the long table, the flickering light of a tactical holo painting her face in shifting blue. Stephen hesitated, the words caught in his throat. He asked if it was safe to speak. Rivers turned to him without pause, his tone even, his gaze steady. In the chain of command, Isabella was the one directly beneath him. She bore the same weight of trust he carried, the same knowledge, the same right to decisions that would decide the war. He trusted her with his life. The softness in her eyes when he said it was not the look of an officer, but of a partner who carried his burdens with him. For a moment, war seemed far away. For a moment, the galaxy narrowed to the bond between them. The chamber darkened as Steve Bott opened its core. Holograms spilled into the room, immense designs unfurling like ancient ghosts returned to light. 5 ships took shape in glowing lines. 1, vast rings interlocked into a spinning lattice, harmonics flowing like water through its frame. Another curved like a crescent blade drawn across the stars. A third resembled Brother, cathedral-like and solemn. 2 more hovered, distinct and alien, their forms heavy with the memory of lost kin. Rivers studied them in silence before choosing. The interlocking ring ship would be constructed here at Sentinel, under its own guardian presence. The other 4 would go to the shield planet, hidden in its cloaks, built in silence beneath the eyes of none but their forges. He turned to Isabella, letting her know this was her charge. She would oversee the transition in person. All Unity ship production was to halt. Every forge, every yard, every line of metal and fire would turn toward these kin vessels. The forges would belong to this work alone. The order carried with it the weight of inevitability. Across Sentinel, yards shifted from refining shields to preparing frame casts for vessels larger than anything they had ever attempted. On the shield planet, engineers and builders received the sealed command. The old songs of Unity vessels went silent, their foundries already rewriting themselves for something far greater. The blueprints glowed around them, silent oaths of what was to come. In that moment, the war no longer belonged only to fleets and battles. It now carried the weight of rebirth. The kin would rise again. The chamber was sealed with layered locks, sound baffled by the hum of private shielding. Only 4 figures stood within, their faces drawn against the weight of what was about to be revealed. Rivers at the head, Isabella Vines steady at his right, Hope across from them with his arms folded, and Stephen pale but alert, Sentinel's pulse faint beneath his skin. Rivers brought the holomap alive. Stars bloomed in pale light, lines of projection stretching outward from Sentinel to Earth, to Cryon to the shield planet and beyond into contested space. He paused, letting the silence weigh on them before calling forward what had been hidden. Shadow Dock appeared, a cluster of vast scaffolds buried in cloak, hulls like black fortresses hanging in silence. Not 4, not 6, but 20. Each one nearly complete, their cores glowing faintly as though they could wake at a word. Rivers let them stand in light long enough for the weight to sink in. He explained the plan with the same calm that had carried him through countless storms. They would not sail as a single hammer to be noticed, but as triads, scattered yet bound by silent command. Each triad of shadows would carry its own Unity fleets, drawn into their orbit like shields and spears. They would be stationed at choke points along the galaxy's arteries, positioned where seams were most likely to be forced open. When the abyss pressed, they would not answer in panic. They would already be there waiting. Hope's expression tightened, the shadows of doubt plain in the furrow of his brow. He asked if centralizing so much strength in secret had not been reckless. The council, already strained under the weight of power it did not fully understand. To unveil 20 more shadows at once, each tied to River's hand, might fracture what little balance they had. River's reply was iron. The abyss did not wait for democracy, and it did not forgive hesitation. The listeners had already shown their hand, weaving songs that could shake whole systems. If they relied on votes and consensus for every movement, they would not survive long enough to cast another. Shadows had been built because delay was death. He would not apologize for giving them a chance to live. Stephen's voice broke the silence after. His tone was weary but unwavering, his gaze fixed on the glowing outlines of the ships. The listeners are escalating, Sentinel whispers it in every beat. Triads may be the only shape that holds. Brother has already shown us what power Unchained can do, but the abyss will not stop. The shadows are not excess. They are necessity. Isabella nodded once, her voice low but sharp. Then let them sail. But let them sail where only you can see them. If the Dominion Council is not ready, better they do not know until the moment they are needed. Rivers dimmed the holomap, the light folding back into shadow. The decision was made. 20 shadows would rise in silence, each with Unity fleets bound to them, each stationed where seams were most likely to bleed. The abyss pressed at the edges of the galaxy, but now the galaxy had its counters waiting in the dark. The seams opened above Cryon space in a storm unlike any before. 50 fractures of silence at once, each spilling void into the stars, each trying to drown the system beneath the weight of the abyss. The halo nets strained, their resonance pulsing across layered rings, but even fourfold defenses bent under the pressure. The first triad moved into the light. 3 shadows, their black hulls vast and silent, formed a triangle of iron in the void. Around each one unfolded a Unity fleet, shields locking, resonance cannons charging in harmony with the shadows they were bound to. 3 shadows. 3 Unity fleets. A full triad of defiance. The listeners poured through, their patchwork ships jagged and angular, cannons screaming in silence. Their chorus struck like thunder with no sound, beams cutting into the nets, bending the lattice of light. For minutes it seemed the defenses would snap. One Unity vessel shuddered as a silence beam cut across its hull, collapsing in fire and scattering its crew into the abyss. But the triad answered. The shadows lit their resonance arrays, cores pulsing with deep vibration. The 3 Unity fleets caught that energy, magnified it, and together they unleashed a wave of electric pulse that tore across the field. Dozens of seams convulsed and folded shut in an instant. The song of silence choked beneath a storm of thunder and light. The listeners staggered. a third of their ships obliterated in the resonance surge. The survivors pressed harder, silence beams lashing into shields, breaking through layers. But the shadows held, wings of steel closing over the wounded. The Unity fleets reformed, interlocks resetting in moments, their cannons ready for another strike. Stephen's warning came through the command net, his body burning from Sentinel's pull. This was not their full chorus. Not yet. They were testing, probing, watching how the Triad would stand. River's voice carried through the net with iron clarity. Hold formation. Close every seam. Deny them their entrance. Pulse after pulse followed. 3 shadows feeding their fleets. 3 Unity armadas striking in rhythm until the seams collapsed one by one. The void blazed with light, resonance storms tearing through the abyss until nothing remained but wreckage and glowing embers adrift in silence. The first Triad had held. The reports reached Sentinel within moments, streams of data carrying the shape of the listener's song. Engineers bent over the recordings, parsing the harmonic structures, searching for the escalation yet to come. At the heart of the Razee 2, River stood at the hollow, his jaw tight. The Shadows and Unity fleets had proven themselves. But Stephen's warning lingered, heavy as iron. This was not the Black Chorus. It was only the prelude. The council chamber rippled with raised voices. Dominion envoys and alliance delegates hurled accusations across the circle, each more heated than the last. The revelation of the Shadows and their Unity escorts had struck them like a hammer. 20 war formations hidden in silence, brought into the light only after their first battle. Some called it brilliance, others betrayal. Rivers stood at the center, motionless against the storm. He let them clash, let the anger bleed itself across the chamber like sparks on iron. When the noise finally crested, his voice cut through it. His command did not require approval. Not when it came to the survival of their worlds, their children, their very existence. While they bickered like schoolyard children over who carried the heavier voice, he had been ensuring they survived long enough to argue at all. Pride was the sickness, not power. Pride was what fractured them once before, splintered their unity when the abyss pressed hardest. Power had never been his pursuit, only protection. He had borne it because someone had to, because hesitation had already cost too much. He reminded them that when the listeners pressed and nearly broke them, it was power held in one hand that had pulled them back from fire. He let the silence grow heavy after. The chamber stared, some shamed, some seething. Then he spoke of himself, calm but unflinching. He did not seek to hold the galaxy forever. He carried plans of retirement, of stepping aside when the war was ended, when peace allowed him to. But he could not lay down command in the midst of a galaxy still burning. Not while every shadow carried the threat of silence. The envoys muttered, some bowing their heads, others still unwilling to yield. But in the center, the truth stood clear. Rivers would not bend to politics. He would not allow pride to undo what survival demanded. The council could rage as much as it pleased. The war did not wait. The chamber still echoed with mutters when Stephen's mark flared. He staggered where he stood, gripping the edge of the council table until the light dimmed. Steve Bot moved with him, voice filters stuttering as if trying to catch a signal. Then the projection burst outward, filling the chamber in pale resonance. Brother's voice moved through Stephen, not in words but in feeling, recognition, sorrow, and direction all at once. Images layered themselves across the hollow, a sweep of stars bending in arcs of light. Among them, one system glowed brighter, marked not by chance but by memory. Brother's message was simple, yet carried the weight of ages. Sentinel was not alone. There had been kin, many kin. Most destroyed, devoured, silenced forever by the abyss. But not all. In the scattered dark, one still lingered. One that had hidden, broken, waiting to be found. The coordinates burned into the hollow for all to see. Stephen collapsed back into his chair, the mark still smoldering at his skin. Steve Bot relaying the fragments brother could not carry alone. The council hushed for the first time since the session began. Even the angriest voices fell silent at the thought. Another kin world. Another brother. Rivers studied the projection, his face carved in iron. This was not politics. This was destiny. He ordered the data locked under his seal, restricted to those in the chamber. Supplies would be gathered, fleets prepared. They could not waste time. For the first time since Brother's awakening, hope burned brighter than fear. Sentinel's orbit filled with motion, the night above the world alive with engines and wakes of light. For days the docks had emptied, fleets pulling free of their berths in preparation for a journey unlike any before. The air of secrecy remained heavy, but the magnitude of the deployment spoke for itself. Rivers stood at the command hollow aboard the Razee 2, the fleet's muster points spiraling outward in quiet precision. 10 shadow triads had been called to Sentinel, 30 vessels in black hulls, each bound with 3 Unity fleets. They moved into formation like silent sentinels themselves, shields folded but resonance humming, ready to march wherever ordered. The remaining 10 triads had already gone. Cloaked under the silence of their own hulls, they folded into space ahead of the fleet, their destination the coordinates Brother had given. They would wait in the void unseen, guardians in shadow should the abyss press its hand too close to the awakening kin. The rest of the muster followed in steady rhythm. Gemini fleet in its full strength, carriers refilled, warhammers gleaming from fresh repair, 150 ships now woven together through countless campaigns. A quarter of the lost fleet came under Isabella's seal, 700 ancient vessels reforged for war, their hulls bearing scars of centuries but their hearts burning new. And from the Dominion, a single vessel from each council member slipped into place, flags raised, banners stretched. Symbol more than might, but Rivers had asked for no more. He wanted their presence, their eyes, their witness to what they sought, but not their fleets scattered should the listeners strike elsewhere while they searched. Brother moved last. The kin-world ship, vast and solemn, broke orbit with engines that made space itself tremble. Its weapons lay silent, but its presence was a fortress in its own right. It would not let Sentinel stand alone. At the core of it all, Rivers' orders moved like iron through the fleet net. Shadows at Sentinel ready to defend the home world. Shadows cloaked at the destination ready to strike unseen. The strength of the Alliance itself, ready to carry hope into the dark. For a moment it almost felt like unity again. A galaxy once broken, now bound by a single purpose. But every commander knew what hung over them. If the listeners had heard, if they had seen, then the march toward kin would not be a quiet one. The stars bent as fold space tore open. One by one, shadows of steel emerged, Gemini fleet at the point, Unity and lost vessels unfolding in waves, and Brother looming like a fortress against the endless black. The coordinates glowed in the nav charts, fixed, certain, yet the space before them lay barren. No world, no light, nothing but void. The comm channels buzzed with unease. Some whispered of mistakes, others of traps. Rivers stood unmoved, eyes fixed on the starfield. He had trusted Sentinel before and it had never failed him. Still, doubt was a shadow in every heart. The doubt lasted less than a minute. Seams split across the dark in jagged arcs, dozens tearing open as though the abyss had been waiting. Silence poured out, washing over the fleets like an unseen tide. The halo nets flared, their layers vibrating against the pressure, resonance cannons already charging as Rivers' orders spread. The battle lit the void. Shadows broke cloak, Unity fleets folded around them, forming shields that rang like thunder when silence beams struck. Lost fleet vessels fired in relentless rhythm, their ancient hulls steady, their pulse cannons biting into seams. The Razee 2 dove through a silence beam, shields flaring as she returned fire in a storm that cut 3 rifts closed in a single volley. Brother held back, silent and still, its hull cloaked in void. It did not fire, did not move. It watched. The battle raged for nearly half an hour. Ships cracked, shields screamed, the void trembled with every pulse. When the last seam folded shut and silence bled away, the fleets braced, waiting for the next strike. But nothing came. The abyss was quiet again. Then the dark shifted. Brother uncloaked first, its vast frame glimmering with resonance, a cathedral of steel and light. And beside it, the shape of another emerged. Vast rings interlocked into a lattice, turning slowly, humming with power even in slumber. Where Brother was solemn, this one was radiant, its features exaggerated as though carved for defiance. It bore markings across its hull like etched flame, traces of battles long forgotten. The hollow charts lit again, a second set of coordinates streaming into Steven's mind, carried through Stevebot's projection. The new kin had not simply awakened, carried the memory of another. The void was no longer empty. and the galaxy no longer held only two kin. Rivers stood before the hollow, the vast projection of the new kinship turning in pale resonance light. Its interlocking rings shifted like a lattice of stars, humming faintly through Stephen's mark. He could feel the pull of it even here aboard the Razee 2. Stephen, weary but steady, confirmed what they both knew. This was one of the blueprints Sentinel had given them. The frame, the rotation, the lattice woven through its hull, every detail matched. Sentinel had carried the knowledge, but Brother had delivered proof. They were not building dreams. They were building kin reborn. Rivers opened his sealed channel, voice cutting into the command line with iron certainty. Construction at Sentinel would halt immediately. The kin vessel already being shaped, there was no longer needed. Its true twin lived. Every forge, every yard at Sentinel would shift to the other designs. The cathedral kin, the crescent blade, the ships shaped for war. The interlocking ring would not be duplicated. Their strength lay in diversity, not copies. He closed the comm and looked back to Stephen. The more kin they awakened, the less silence the listeners could press against them. The council chamber flared with tension. Delegates and commanders gathered around the projection, voices hushed in awe and dread alike. Some whispered of unstoppable power. Others worried of imbalance. Rivers cut them short. The seams had opened within minutes of their arrival. This kin had been hunted. The listeners already knew. If they delayed, another brother would burn. The conclusion was swift and without debate. They had to move. Coordinates streamed into the fold space engines. Orders spread like fire. Gemini fleet armed to the teeth. Shadow triads coiled like serpents. Unity fleets shifting into their interlocks. The lost fleet followed in Isabella's seal, steady as ever. When the void tore open and the fleets fell out of fold space, they did not find emptiness. They emerged into chaos. The kin ship was already embattled, its hull cracked by silence beams, its shields pulsing under relentless fire. Listeners swarmed in black waves, seams splitting wider to pour more into the field. The kin fired resonance in desperate arcs, closing some rifts only for others to bloom behind them. The alliance had arrived late. Brother moved with the fleets, and when its pulse lit the void, it was met with an answering flare from its wounded sibling. Two kin side by side, casting thunder into the abyss. But the black chorus was louder still, and the battlefield shook with its fury. The battle for the wounded kin raged in chaos. Silence beams tore across the field, hammering at the crippled vessel's shields until they flickered like dying stars. The alliance pressed hard, Gemini fleet weaving between rifts, shadows, and Unity fleets closing seams as fast as they opened, but the listeners poured through in relentless waves. The kin that had been found here fought back with what strength remained, its great frame glowing with fractured resonance, pulses erupting in fits and starts. Each blast closed seams, but it could not keep pace. Its hull bled fire, its arcs breaking under the strain of silence. Alone it would not last. Then the void ripped apart. Fold space tore open behind the battle line, and out of the storm emerged the kin they had found first, the lattice vessel. Its interlocking rings spun with a hum of power, resonance already alive in its frame. In one fluid motion it joined the fight, pulsing in rhythm with Brother. Three kin now stood together. Their voices rose in harmony, a wave of resonance that rolled across the field like a storm. Dozens of seams collapsed in an instant, silence beams fracturing against shields reinforced by kinborn strength. The listeners faltered, their chorus breaking under the weight of three voices singing against them. Rivers seized the opening, ordering Gemini fleet to drive hard at the heart of the rift lines. The Razee 2 burned forward, flanked by Scuda V and the Aegis, shields blazing as they cut a path through wreckage and fire. The Unity fleets interlocked tighter, feeding their resonance into the kin's pulses, amplifying the storm until the void trembled. The wounded kin steadied, its shields reforged in the shelter of its siblings. With a great convulsion of light, it pulsed again, closing three seams in a single breath. Its fire returned, no longer alone, no longer failing. For half an hour the storm raged. Shadows cloaked and struck, lost fleet cannons thundered, and the kin voices sang with fury. One by one the seams buckled. One by one the abyss retreated. And at last silence fell across the field, the true silence of victory. Three kin remained where only one had stood before. Brother steady and solemn. the lattice kin turning with defiant hum, and the wounded kin, scarred but alive, its shields shining once more. The Alliance gathered around them, fleets battered but unbroken. For the first time in living memory, the Abyss had been driven back not by chance, but by power too great to deny. And for the first time, the listeners had fled before the chorus of kin. The battlefield was quiet now, the scars of the fight drifting as wreckage across the void. 3 kin held their places at the center, shields reforging, resonance humming low. The wounded kin burned faintly where silence beams had torn through its armor, whole sections of its frame blackened. Yet it lived. And it lived because they had come. Aboard the Razee 2, Rivers opened his private channel. His voice carried across the void to Sentinel. All forges were to be cleared at once. Every dock, every bay, every foundry was to be emptied and prepared. A kin ship, scarred and broken, would be returning with them. Repairs of that scale would take every hand and every resource Sentinel had. When the order reached the council chamber, the silence broke into murmurs. Fear whispered and sharp. The kin had minds of their own. They moved without council approval, chose their own moments to strike. Some envoys spoke as though the Alliance had awakened something more dangerous than the listeners themselves. Rivers stood unmoved. His words cut the noise with the weight of iron. Alone, the kin were as vulnerable as any of them. A wounded kin could burn as easily as a wounded fleet. The only reason it lived now was because they had protected it. And the only reason they stood at all was because the kin had shielded them in return. They were not masters in weapons. They were guardians, and they were to be guarded in turn. If the Alliance sought survival, then they would not simply wield the kin. They would stand beside them. The chamber fell into uneasy silence. Fear still lingered, but the truth had been carved through it. The war had shown them a new truth. Survival was no longer measured by fleets and fire alone. It now rested on the bond between worlds and kin, guardians and the guarded, each giving what the other could not. And with 3 awakened, the balance of the galaxy had already shifted. The return to Sentinel was a procession of power and scars. The kin moved at the heart of the formation, brother steady and bright, the lattice vessel humming in precise rhythm, and the wounded kin drifting behind under escort. Its damage was vast, whole arcs blackened and frames split, too large to slip into any dock Sentinel had ever built. When the fleet reached orbit, something extraordinary happened. The wounded kin shuddered once, then broke apart in a slow, deliberate motion. Rings unfolded, sections unlocked, massive girders separating until the ship's pieces spread out into the shape of vessels Sentinel's cradles could accept. The forges had once been its birthplace, and now, broken and scarred, it remembered how to return. Sentinel's arms reached wide, docking clamps locking into place as though welcoming home a child. The kin settled into the docks with almost a sigh, resonance dimming as repairs began. Later, in the quiet of his chamber, Stephen felt the pull of brother. The words came heavy with recognition, names carried on waves of memory. The kin resting in the cradles was Mishi. The lattice vessel was a son. Their voices were distinct, different, yet bound together as siblings in the long silence of the void. Brother told him more. A son carried the memory of another, Zeph. A cathedral kin, larger even than brother, older, more powerful, though shaped differently. If it still lived, it could be the anchor they needed. But brother held back the final coordinates, a promise deferred until the time was right. Stephen shared what he had heard with Rivers and Hope. Their faces turned grim. If the listeners learned of Zeph before they moved, the chance of finding it alive would vanish. They had to be ready the instant the truth was revealed. Rivers wasted no time. Gemini fleet was placed on full standby, every ship armed and waiting. Shadow triads spread back into their hidden posts, 3 by 3, woven across the void to guard against sudden seams. The lost fleet, now fully awakened in its thousands strong, was spun up to full readiness under Isabella's command. They would move with Gemini when the call came. Brother remained solemn. It would go when the time came, but not yet. Mishi was still broken, still in pieces within Sentinel's arms. It would not leave until its sibling was whole again. And so the Alliance held its breath, fleets ready, kin rising. The war pressed closer, but for the first time they were no longer searching blindly. They were preparing for the awakening of Zeph. The alarms tore through Sentinel's calm. The Abyss had come for the heart itself. Seams erupted across orbit, 100 black fractures spilling silence into the void. From them poured listener ships in relentless waves, their silence beams converging into a chorus sharper than any heard before. At their center loomed something greater still, a cathedral vessel of the abyss, vast as a city, its jagged hull layered with stolen designs. Its silence pressed like a weight on every mind, a suffocating shadow across the world below. The Alliance surged to meet it. Gemini fleet broke from orbit in tight formation, shadows decloaking in triads, Unity fleets folding into their shields, Lost Fleet cannons opening fire in steady rhythm. Sentinel's halo nets blazed against the silence, shaking under the strain. Above them only two kin stood ready, brother in his solemn strength and a son, the lattice kin weaving resonance like blades of light. Mishi lay in pieces within Sentinel's cradles, still broken, still silent. The battle was brutal. The listener fleet struck in coordinated waves, beams slicing into shields until even shadows buckled under the weight. Unity fleets staggered, their interlocks breaking and reforging again in desperation. The Lost Fleet took the brunt, their ancient hulls cracking, but still they fired. The cathedral ship pressed hardest, its silence beam a single lance wide enough to carve through fleets. It cut into orbit, nearly breaching the halo net, and for a heartbeat it seemed even kin-born shields would falter. Then Rivers gave the order. Brother, a son, and Sentinel itself rose together. Their resonance flared in layered arcs, harmonics folding into one another until the void itself trembled. In a single thunderous heartbeat, they unleashed the Fury Blast. The blast struck the cathedral ship in full, tearing through its silence, ripping its shields apart like thin cloth. Cracks split its jagged frame, fire bleeding from its core. The abyssal chorus faltered, silence sputtering into broken fragments. The Alliance pressed. Gemini fleet poured everything into the crippled citadel, Lost Fleet guns pounding weak points, shadows carving through stragglers. Unity fleets refocused their resonance, hammering it from every side until the giants staggered. When the void cleared, the cathedral ship drifted in ruin, its weapons dark, its hull bleeding wreckage. The seams collapsed one by one, the surviving listeners fleeing back into the abyss. Sentinel had been scarred, fleets battered, but they had held. River's voice cut through the net like iron. The cathedral ship was not to be destroyed. It would be crippled, dismantled, and studied. Every weapon, every circuit, every stolen design would be pulled apart until they understood it. The Abyss had revealed a new weapon, and now that weapon would belong to the Alliance. Above Sentinel, brother and a son stood side by side, shields dimmed but steady. Below, Mishi remained silent in the cradles, waiting to rise. The listener cathedral drifted in the cradles like a dead god. Shipyards ran like a city of needles, cranes and servos peeling back armor plating the size of continents. Engineers moved through its ribs with reverence and hunger, prying open rooms that had never seen a human touch. Every cut revealed contraband. Alloys that shifted under a heat lamp, conduits braided with crystalline filaments that sang when current passed, and panels etched in languages no archive could match. At first the work was harvest, salvage what can be used, catalog what cannot. But the deeper teams went, the clearer the purpose of the vessel became. This was not merely a weapon platform. It was an instrument. Its architecture was a cathedral in the literal sense, a space built to shape sound into physics, to bend resonance into geometry and fire it at the seams between worlds. Cavities the size of bays acted as resonant chambers. Nested rings of crystal focused and phase-shifted the tones. Cores pulsed with a cadence that did more than vibrate metal. It twisted fold space at the seam's throat. Where Alliance scientists had called the listener's attacks harmony, the cathedral made plain the mechanism. Song as engine, song as scalpel, song as siege. Illyrian physicists led the first full readout. The cathedral's voice was built from layered harmonics, each layer tuned to a different spatial frequency. One band disrupted shields by exciting microresonances in lattice fields. Another bent local fold geometry to widen seams. A lower chorus drove whole halo lattices into destructive interference. The ship did not merely shoot a beam. It constructed a transient scaffold of resonance that the choir sang through, and that scaffold became the channel the seam needed to open and swallow. The cathedral amplified, timed, and sustained those structures with a precision that made the rupture systematic rather than random. The core discovery was simple and terrible. The song required structure and feedback. Crystalline filaments acted like antennas, but instead of receiving, they fed back into a nested chorus across the ship. When a single harmonic struck the surrounding space, sensors across the hull read the response and adjusted phase and amplitude in milliseconds. The result was an adaptive instrument that learned the weakness of whatever it faced and exploited it in real time. The listeners had not only built weapons, they had built learning choirs. Rivers watched the reports as crews carried module after module into clean rooms. He stood with Hope and a ring of Illyrian and Dominion leads, all of them tired, all of them lit by the glow of half a cathedral's guts spread across the hangar floor. The question that moved from mind to mind was the same. If this is how they sing at us, can we sing back? The engineers answered with equal parts certainty and caution. Yes, if you replicate the structure. No, if you fail to replicate the adaptive feedback in the phase control. The Illyrians sketched counter-harmonic profiles that could collapse the scaffold the cathedral built. Dominic physicists transposed those sketches into a concept, a transient counterchorus that would not aim to mimic the listener's song, but to cancel its core harmonics, to force the scaffold to destructively interfere with itself. In plain terms, a weapon that would not break a seam by brute force but by making the song fall on itself. Hope pressed the practical question. Could such a system be made and fired without becoming a beacon? The listeners had shown a habit of learning. If the Alliance forged an instrument that sang in chords the Abyss now recognized, it might teach the choir new counterpoints faster than any workshop could learn to rework shields. Worse, an aggressive resonance weapon might rip its own seams. The cathedral's core had been built with technologies apparently derived from fold space interaction. Reverse the polarity a degree or two and a pulse meant to collapse a seam could widen it. Stephen sat through the readouts pale and quiet. He had listened with Sentinel while the cathedral stitched its song into the sky. He knew the feel of a chorus like an ache in his blood. He could speak of the song's effect on living systems, how the lower bands induced a sense of weight, how some harmonics left neurological traces in exposed crews. He told the council that replicating the song would be more than a weapons program. It would be a cultural signal, a claim that the Alliance would sing like a choir. That claim would be heard. The debate pivoted along that warning. Engineers wanted trials. Rivers wanted a prototype and then a fleet of counter-units to stand where Halo nets might fail. Hope argued for limits and slow iteration, insisting on fail-safes and cloaked testbeds far from human worlds. Dominion members argued about precedent. Some thought it an opportunity to end the listeners forever. Others saw danger. A new arms race in resonance that would escalate the choir to new, worse forms. Rivers closed the council with a weight that left no comfortable votes. He would not permit paralysis. He ordered a prototype program under strict secrecy. A single trial bed far from populated systems, a directed laboratory array where Illyrian resonators could be run against recorded fragments of the choir. The prototype would be a counter-harmonic system, not a mirror, designed to collapse the cathedral's scaffold rather than build a new scaffold of their own. Hope was granted oversight and veto on operational use. Engineers were given resources and a quarantine protocol. Stephen and SteveBot were assigned to monitor for neuroresonant side effects, to run early cognitive and biological tests so that the weapon could not inadvertently harm pilots or commanders who came near it. The final note of the session was not triumph. There was a plan, yes, and the will to build it. There was also the knowledge that they had taken the listener's instrument apart, seen how the song was made, and now planned to play with the same raw materials. That moved them from defense into an unfamiliar category, maker of the same thing the Abyss had used against them. The ethical questions hung heavy, and the council folded them into spreadsheets and watchwords and chains of command because there was no time for philosophy in the face of a chorus that would keep learning. The last image of the day was quieter. In a staging hangar beneath Sentinel, engines hummed as technicians aligned crystal filaments into new housings. SteveBot sat nearby and processed data in lines of light. Stephen watching the patterns like a man reading an old language and hoping at least to understand the letters before they became words again. Rivers walked the line of technicians and stopped at the prototype's core. He laid his hand against the housing and thought not of the power it would give him, but of the shields it might allow to hold a child on a surface world while seams screamed at the sky. The prototype would be tested at midnight 2 cycles hence, away from tides and moons and living harbor. They would not fire it into a populated seam. They would first collapse a sealed echo of a seam in a cloaked void, and they would measure everything that bled from that collapse: sound, phase, life signature. If the choir learned, then the prototype would die in the lab before it ever saw an open sky. Still, the knowledge was made plain. The song had an anatomy. That anatomy could be answered. Rivers and Hope both understood the implication. You cannot unhear a discovered melody. The rest of the war would be shaped around the choice to play it or to refuse and be played. The decision had been made. The prototype was being built. The dawn that followed would find them listening for the choir's next verse. The forges thundered. Sentinel's arms glowed like rivers of fire as the broken frame of Mishi reknit itself piece by piece. Cranes swung in arcs. Engineers swarmed across plating the size of cities. Resonance conduits were soldered and sealed with care, more like surgery than construction. Weeks of labor, endless cycles of hammer and weld, had brought the kin back together. When at last the final plates slid into place, Sentinel's skies went still. The lights of the cradles dimmed as though the world itself held its breath. Then Mishi awoke. The great vessel shuddered once, a low vibration rolling out that made every dock tremble. Its shields flared in bands of blue-white light, and its pulse resonated so deep that even those planetside felt it echo in their bones. Across the void, brother and a son answered, their resonance harmonizing, the voices of three kin carrying through the dark. The awakening was not a roar, but a ceremony. Every ship in orbit dimmed its lights, standing silent as the kin's pulse filled the stars. Crews lined viewports, council members stood from their seats, soldiers laid down their arms in reverence. It was not a weapon being born again. It was a guardian returned. Stephen staggered as the voices of kin swelled within him. Mishi's voice was solemn and strong, a son precise and clear, brother heavy with memory. They sang together, but then brother spoke alone. It carried not just feeling but direction, a weight that pressed into Stephen's mark like fire. Zeph. Coordinates flooded into his mind, etched across his thoughts until he could see them as plainly as the stars above Sentinel. A cathedral kin larger than brother, stronger, different, waiting if it had survived the silence. Stephen carried the word without pause. He found Rivers at the command table, the glow of kin still burning through his skin, and spoke the coordinates aloud. The hollow lit with a distant sector of the galaxy, faint and far, but alive with possibility. Rivers didn't hesitate. He come directly into his private channels, sealed and silent. Select shadow triads received the order. Coordinates burned into their navigation. They would depart first, cloaked and waiting, ready to guard the void before the Alliance moved. The chamber dimmed. The echoes of Mishi's rebirth still rang through the stars, but already the next step was set. Three kin now stood awake. A fourth called to them from the dark. Stay tuned and subscribe as Rivers and the Gemini fleet awaken a new kinship, Zeph.